My neighbor was way too nice for years, then I found out why everyone else avoided him. I used to think the idea of bad vibes was mostly nonsense. Something people said when they couldn't explain why they didn't like someone. I believed in evidence, not instincts. If someone was polite, helpful, and never gave you a concrete reason to distrust them, then distrusting them felt unfair. That mindset is the only reason this story exists. I moved into my apartment in my late 20s, fresh off a breakup and looking for a reset. Nothing dramatic, just tired of noise, tired of shared walls with people who threw parties on weeknights, tired of living in places that felt temporary. This building wasn't fancy, but it was quiet, clean, and affordable. Mostly older tenants, people who nodded in the hallway but didn't linger. On my very first day, while I was struggling to carry a box up the stairs, a man stepped out of the apartment across from mine and offered to help. "New neighbor?" he asked, already reaching for the box before I could answer. His name was Richard, mid-40s, maybe early 50s, soft voice, calm smile, dressed neatly but not stylishly. The kind of person you'd describe as harmless without thinking twice. He helped me carry boxes in, asked where I was moving from, told me he'd lived in the building longer than most. Before he left, he handed me a small piece of paper with his number on it. "Just in case you ever need anything," he said, "I keep an eye on the place." At the time, I thought that was comforting. Over the next few weeks, I noticed something odd but not alarming. Other neighbors weren't as friendly with him. They weren't rude exactly, just brief, polite smiles that ended quickly, conversations that didn't last longer than necessary. If Richard was already talking to someone in the hallway and I approached, the conversation usually wrapped up fast. I assumed it was just personalities clashing. Not everyone likes to chat. Richard, on the other hand, was always available. He knew the building inside and out, which pipes made noise, which doors stuck, which delivery drivers were reliable. He told me stories about past tenants, most of whom I'd never met. He framed them as cautionary tales: loud couples, people who didn't pay rent, tenants who didn't last. I didn't question it. Long-term residents always have stories. At some point, Richard started anticipating things. If a package was delivered while I was at work, he'd text me before I even checked the tracking. If maintenance was scheduled, he'd mention it before I saw the notice. If I came home late, he'd ask if everything was okay. "Just making sure you got in safe," he'd say, smiling. I told myself he was just lonely. The first moment I felt genuinely uncomfortable was small enough that I almost ignored it. I came home one evening and noticed my door wasn't locked. I knew I'd locked it, I always did. It was muscle memory at that point. I stood there for a few seconds, heart pounding, scanning the hallway. Nothing was out of place inside, nothing missing, nothing obviously disturbed. An hour later, I ran into Richard while taking out the trash. "Oh," he said casually, "maintenance stopped by earlier. I let them in since you weren't home, must have forgotten to lock up." My stomach dropped. No one had told me maintenance was coming that day, no email, no notice, and even if they had, no one had ever let themselves into my apartment without my consent. I asked him why he had my key. He looked surprised, then laughed lightly. "Building master key," he said. "They give one to long-term residents for emergencies, floods, gas leaks, stuff like that." That didn't sound right. But I didn't know enough to challenge it. I told myself to be grateful, to not assume the worst, to not be rude. After that, I became more aware of how often Richard was around. He always seemed to be in the hallway when I left or returned, always had some comment ready. Sometimes he knew details about my schedule I was sure I'd never told him. When I mentioned I might be looking for a new job, he asked a few days later how the interview went. I hadn't told him about an interview. When I corrected him, he smiled apologetically. "Must have misunderstood," he said, "easy to mix things up." That's when I started noticing how often he misunderstood things in ways that gave him more information than he should have had. I asked another neighbor about him once, just casually. I mentioned Richard's name while we were waiting for the elevator. The neighbor's expression changed instantly. Not fear, not anger. Caution. "He still lives here?" she asked. That was the moment I realized I might have been the only one who thought Richard was harmless. The way she said it, "he still lives here," wasn't dramatic, but it hit me like cold water. It wasn't curiosity, it wasn't gossip. It was the kind of reaction you have when you see a familiar shape in the dark and your body reacts before your brain can explain why. I tried to play it off. "Yeah," I said, keeping my voice casual. "He's across from me, Richard, he's been friendly." The neighbor, an older woman I'd seen a few times, always with a tote bag and a purposeful walk, pressed her lips together. The elevator doors took forever to close and the silence felt louder than the hallway. "I wouldn't," she said finally, "I wouldn't get too comfortable with him." That was all she offered. Before I could ask anything else, she stepped into the elevator and hit her floor, eyes forward, conversation closed. When the doors shut, I stood there staring at my own reflection in the metal paneling, suddenly aware of how exposed I felt in a place I'd assumed was safe. That night I tried to reason it out. Buildings are full of dynamics. Maybe Richard had argued with someone, maybe he was nosy and people didn't like it, maybe he was just awkward. I'd lived in enough apartments to know that one person can become the unofficial weird neighbor for reasons that aren't necessarily dangerous. Sometimes it's just personality. Still, I couldn't shake her tone, and I couldn't stop thinking about the master key claim. So I did the thing I should have done the first time. I called the building office. The next morning, on my commute to work, I stepped aside and dialed the number on my lease. When the receptionist picked up, I told her I had a question about keys, trying to keep it casual. "Do long-term residents ever get a building master key for emergencies?" I asked. There was a pause, the kind where you can hear the person on the other end processing whether you're serious. "No," she said slowly, "maintenance has access keys, tenants do not." I felt my throat tighten. "So there's no situation where a tenant would have access to someone else's unit?" I pushed. "Absolutely not," she said, firmer now. "If someone told you that, they're mistaken, maintenance only, and we would never authorize entry without notice unless it's an emergency." Yeah. I thanked her and hung up with my heart beating harder than it should have been for a phone call. For the rest of the day, I kept replaying Richard's casual smile when he said he'd let maintenance in, the relaxed confidence, the way he delivered it like he was doing me a favor, like he expected me to thank him. I didn't go home that evening feeling relieved. I went home feeling watched. When I turned the corner toward my apartment, Richard's door was slightly open, just a crack, enough to suggest he might be stepping out. I slowed without thinking, my senses suddenly sharp, and right on cue, his door opened fully and he appeared with a garbage bag in his hand. "Hey," he said like this was the most natural coincidence in the world. "Good timing, how was your day?" I forced a smile. "Fine." He looked at me for a second longer than usual, not staring exactly, more like studying, like he could tell something had shifted. "You seem tired," he said gently. "Just work." He nodded, then stepped slightly closer, still in his doorway. "If you ever need anything, you know I'm right here." The way he said it made my skin prickle. It was meant to sound supportive, but it landed like a reminder. I mumbled a quick thanks and unlocked my door, and as soon as I was inside, I locked it behind me and stood there listening. I heard his door close a few seconds later. That night, I did a full sweep of my apartment like I was in some weird crime show. I checked windows, I checked the balcony door, I checked every room for signs someone had been there, nothing obvious, which somehow made it worse because it meant if he had been inside, he knew how to do it without leaving traces. I barely slept. Every creak in the building made my mind jump. I kept imagining footsteps outside my door, the soft click of a lock turning, the sound of someone entering with confidence. The next morning, I bought a cheap door alarm on my lunch break, the kind that screeches if the door opens. Not a fancy security system, just something simple that would at least confirm whether my fear was real or my imagination running wild. When I installed it that evening, Richard knocked on my door. Not aggressively, not loudly, just a polite tap tap tap. I froze. For a second I considered not answering, pretending I wasn't home, but the lights were on and I'd just made noise near the entryway. I opened the door a crack, keeping the chain on. Richard smiled like nothing was wrong. "Everything okay?" I heard some banging. "Just fixing something," I said. He tilted his head slightly. "Fixing what?" His tone was light, but the question felt invasive. It reminded me of how he always asked for details, always wanted context, always wanted to know just a bit more than a normal neighbor would. Just a latch, I said, vague on purpose. His eyes flicked briefly toward the edge of the door like he was trying to see what I'd installed. Then he smiled again. You know, he said softly, you don't have to worry so much in this building, it's safe, I make sure of that. I felt my pulse spike. What do you mean you make sure of that? I asked, trying to sound casual. He chuckled, just neighborhood watch style, you know, I notice things. I nodded without smiling. Okay. He held my gaze for a beat, then said, well, if you need anything, I'm right here. Again with that line, again with that gentle insistence. After I closed the door, I leaned my forehead against it, trying to steady my breathing. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop all over again. There was a faint scratch near the lock, barely visible unless you were looking for it, like metal had scraped metal, like a key had been used too forcefully. My lock hadn't looked like that when I moved in. I took a photo with my phone, then looked closer. The scratch wasn't just random wear, it was a pattern, multiple tiny marks like someone had tried to manipulate the lock more than once. That night I didn't sleep at all. The next day I requested a lock change through the building office. They told me they'd schedule maintenance within a week. A week felt like a year. I asked if it could be urgent. The receptionist hesitated, then said she'd see what she could do. I spent that entire week on edge. And Richard somehow seemed to know. He became more present, more attentive. He'd appear in the hallway when I left, ask how my day was, comment on the weather like he was trying to keep the conversation going. When I gave short answers, he didn't seem offended. He seemed amused. One evening, I came home carrying groceries and found a small bag hanging from my doorknob. No note, just a plastic bag with a box of tea, a jar of honey, and a small loaf of bread. My first reaction was disgust, not gratitude. My second was fear. I knocked on Richard's door before I could talk myself out of it. He answered almost immediately, like he'd been waiting. Oh good, he said, smiling warmly, you got it. What is this? I asked, holding up the bag. A little welcome gift, he said, you seemed stressed lately. I stared at him. How would you know I'm stressed? His smile didn't falter. People show it, I'm observant. I wanted to throw the bag in the trash. I wanted to tell him to stop. I wanted to demand he leave me alone. Instead, I said thanks, like an idiot, because confrontation felt dangerous and politeness felt safer. But the truth was, politeness wasn't saving me, it was feeding whatever this was. That night, I called the neighbor from the elevator, the older woman. I didn't even know her name, but I'd seen her mailbox label. I found her unit number and knocked. She opened the door a few inches, chain on, the same way I'd opened mine. Yes, she asked, wary. I'm sorry, I said quickly. I know this is weird, but you reacted when I mentioned Richard. Can you tell me why? Her eyes narrowed. She looked past me into the hallway, then back at my face. You live across from him, she asked. I nodded. She exhaled slowly. Come in, she said, and unhooked the chain. Her apartment smelled like coffee and old books. She motioned for me to sit at her kitchen table, then poured 2 cups without asking. Her hands were steady, but her face carried something I couldn't name, not just caution, history. He's not supposed to be here, she said quietly. My stomach turned. What do you mean? She took a sip of coffee, then set the mug down carefully. He used to be the building superintendent years ago, not officially, but he acted like it, had access, knew everyone's routines. I felt cold all over. How does he have access now? He shouldn't, she said, but Richard has ways. He makes copies, he convinces people to hand things over, he's good at sounding reasonable. My mouth went dry. Has he done something? She hesitated, then nodded slowly. To multiple people, not always the same thing. Sometimes it's stealing, sometimes it's intimidation, sometimes it's worse. My heart hammered. Worse how? She looked at me for a long moment, like she was deciding how much truth I could handle. Richard likes to feel involved in other people's lives, she said carefully. He inserts himself, he gathers information, he creates situations where you need him, and if you try to shut him out, he gets angry, quietly, patiently, like a man who believes he's entitled to you. My skin crawled. Why is he still here? I asked. She sighed, because he knows how to stay just inside the line. He never does anything that's easy to prove. He's charming, he's helpful, and people don't want to deal with him, they move out instead. I stared at the coffee, my hands trembling slightly. Has anyone reported him? She nodded again, many times, but it's always he said, she said. And he's been doing this long enough to know what not to do in writing. He knows which cameras don't work, he knows where the blind spots are, he knows how to make you feel crazy. That last sentence hit me hard. Make you feel crazy. I thought about the unlocked door, the maintenance story, the scratches on my lock, the gift bag, the way he always seemed to know where I was. I swallowed. What should I do? She leaned forward slightly. Change your locks, document everything. Stop accepting favors, stop being polite, and if you ever feel unsafe, don't hesitate to call someone, not him, not the building, someone who will actually show up. I left her apartment feeling like the hallway lights were too bright, every shadow felt suspicious, every sound felt amplified. When I reached my door, I hesitated before unlocking it. The gift bag was gone. I froze. I hadn't taken it inside. I'd left it in the hall outside my door when I went to talk to her. Now it was gone. I turned slowly toward Richard's door, my pulse thundering. His door was closed. For a second, I considered knocking, demanding to know if he'd taken it back. But the neighbor's warning echoed in my mind, stop being polite but don't be reckless. I went inside, locked the door and pressed my back against it. The cheap door alarm was still in place. But I realized something that made my blood run colder than fear. Richard didn't need to break into my apartment to make his point. He just needed to let me know he could reach into my life whenever he wanted. After that night, I stopped pretending this was just a personality clash or a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with better communication. Something had crossed a line, and even though I couldn't point to a single dramatic act, the pattern was undeniable. Richard wasn't just a neighbor who overstepped. He was someone who treated access to other people's lives like a right, not a privilege. I started documenting everything. Every interaction, every message, every time I saw him lingering in the hallway without an obvious reason. I wrote down dates, times, exact wording. I took photos of the scratches near my lock from different angles, just in case someone later tried to tell me it was normal wear and tear. I saved the building office's email confirming that no tenant should ever have access keys. I even wrote down how often he knocked on my door, what time it happened, how long he stood there before leaving. It felt excessive, paranoid even. But something the older neighbor had said kept replaying in my head. He knows how to make you feel crazy. I wasn't going to let that happen. For a few days, Richard kept his distance. He still appeared in the hallway sometimes, but he didn't initiate conversation. When our paths crossed, he'd nod politely and keep walking. That brief lull almost made me relax, which scared me more than the constant attention had. Then the notes started. The first one was taped to my door when I got home from work, just a small piece of paper folded neatly. Hope you're doing okay, haven't seen you much lately. No name, no signature. I stood there for a long time before taking it down. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to breathe slowly to stay grounded. I took a photo of it before throwing it away. The second note came 2 days later, slipped under my door. You don't have to shut people out, that's how misunderstandings happen. That one felt different, less friendly, more pointed, like a warning disguised as concern. I didn't respond, I didn't acknowledge it in any way. The neighbor had been clear, stop engaging. Around the same time, I noticed subtle changes in the building. Maintenance requests took longer to be addressed. Packages I was expecting showed up late or marked delivered when they weren't there yet. Once, I found my doormat slightly crooked as if someone had moved it and tried to put it back the way it was. None of it was dramatic enough to call the police. All of it was enough to make me feel constantly on edge. I changed my routines. I left for work at slightly different times. I took the stairs instead of the elevator. I started locking my bedroom door at night, even though it felt ridiculous in a one-bedroom apartment. I kept my phone charged and within reach at all times. And through all of it, Richard stayed just within sight. One evening, as I was coming home later than usual, I saw him standing at the end of the hallway talking to a couple I'd never seen before. They were holding a clipboard. My stomach dropped. I slowed down, pretending to check my phone, listening as I got closer. Just making sure everything's in order, one of them was saying. Richard nodded seriously. Of course, I always help out when I can. When they noticed me, Richard turned and smiled. Hey, perfect timing, these folks are doing a quick building check. I looked at the couple. Who are you? I asked. They exchanged a glance. Oh, we're with, the man started, then hesitated. We're just helping management with. Management didn't mention anything to me, I said, keeping my voice steady. Richard laughed lightly. They don't always notify everyone, it's routine. I met his eyes. For the first time, I didn't look away. Which company are you with? I asked the couple again. They looked uncomfortable now. The woman shifted her weight. Actually, I think we might have the wrong floor, she said quickly. They turned and walked toward the stairs without another word. The moment they were gone, Richard's smile dropped. Just for a second. Then it came back, tighter this time. You didn't have to make that awkward, he said. My heart was pounding, but I didn't back down. I don't appreciate strangers being told they can come to my door. He studied my face, really studied it, then he nodded slowly. Fair enough, he said, I was just trying to help. I unlocked my door and went inside without responding. I locked it behind me and leaned against it, shaking. That night, I emailed the building office again. I described everything. The unlocked door, the false maintenance claim, the notes, the fake building check. I attached photos, screenshots, dates, times. I didn't sugarcoat anything. The response came the next morning. They thanked me for bringing it to their attention. They said they were looking into the situation. They advised me to contact the police if I felt unsafe, which felt like passing the responsibility to someone else. I didn't hear anything else from them for days. Richard, however, changed tactics again. He stopped appearing in the hallway altogether. No notes, no knocks, no gifts, nothing. The silence was worse than the attention. It made me feel like something was being planned. One night around 2 a.m., my door alarm went off. The sound was piercing, violent in the quiet of the apartment. I bolted upright in bed, heart racing, adrenaline flooding my system. For a split second, I couldn't move. Then I grabbed my phone and rushed to the door. The alarm was screaming, but the door itself was still closed. Locked, I looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I waited, shaking, until the alarm stopped. I checked the lock. There were fresh scratches, deeper this time. I called the police. When they arrived, they were polite but skeptical. They looked at the lock, took notes, asked if I had enemies, if I'd lost a key, if I was sure the alarm wasn't triggered accidentally. I showed them my documentation, the notes, the emails, the photos. One of them exchanged a look with the other. They knocked on Richard's door. No answer. They told me they'd file a report, that they couldn't do much without catching him in the act, that I should consider staying with a friend for a few days if I felt unsafe. As they left, one of them said quietly, "You did the right thing calling." I locked the door and sat on the floor, my back against it, for a long time after that. The next morning, I found a notice taped to Richard's door. Access privileges revoked, building management. My hands shook as I read it. Later that day, I got an email from the building office. They confirmed that Richard had never been authorized to hold keys or act on their behalf. They said they were taking appropriate action. They didn't specify what that meant. That evening, as I was packing a bag to stay with a friend for a few nights, I heard footsteps outside my door. Slow, deliberate. They stopped right in front of it. I held my breath. There was no knock. Just a soft voice through the door. "You didn't have to do all this," Richard said. My entire body went cold. I didn't answer. I stood there in the middle of my living room, phone clenched in my hand, every muscle in my body locked tight, listening to my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. On the other side of the door, Richard exhaled slowly. "I was just trying to look out for you," he said. His voice was calm, almost hurt, like I was the one who'd crossed a line. People misunderstand things when they get scared. I backed away from the door, step by careful step, until my back hit the wall. I didn't trust myself to speak. Anything I said would invite a response, and I didn't want a conversation. I wanted distance. After a moment, he continued. "You didn't even talk to me first," he said softly. "That's what hurts the most." That word again, hurts. As if this were an emotional disagreement between equals. As if he hadn't lied, manipulated, and tested the limits of my safety for months. As if the scratches on my lock and the alarm screaming in the middle of the night were just misunderstandings. "I thought you were smarter than that," he added, and this time there was something sharper underneath the words. Not anger exactly, disappointment, ownership. My phone buzzed in my hand, a text from the older neighbor. "Are you okay? I just saw him outside your door." I typed back with shaking fingers. "He's here talking through the door." "Do not open it," she replied immediately. "I'm calling management." A few seconds later, Richard's tone changed again, brighter, lighter. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "I won't bother you tonight, you've clearly made up your mind." I listened as his footsteps moved away, slow and deliberate, like he wanted me to hear every step. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, building management called me. Their tone was very different this time. Serious, apologetic. They told me Richard had been formally banned from accessing any common areas beyond his unit and that eviction proceedings were being initiated based on multiple complaints, not just mine. That part stunned me. Multiple complaints. Apparently, once I'd documented everything and pushed hard enough, others had come forward. Things they'd brushed off, things they'd endured quietly, locked doors found unlocked, personal information Richard shouldn't have known, help that crossed into intrusion, people who'd moved out early without ever fully understanding why they felt unsafe. I wasn't the first. I'd just been the one who stopped being polite. Richard was gone 3 weeks later. No announcement, no confrontation. One day his door was closed and the next day it was sealed with a notice. Maintenance came and changed the locks. The hallway felt different, quieter in a way that didn't feel tense anymore. For a long time after that, I jumped at sounds outside my door. I checked locks compulsively. I kept the alarm armed even during the day. Trauma doesn't disappear just because the threat does. But slowly the fear faded. What stayed with me was the lesson. Not all danger is loud, not all threats look threatening. Some of them smile, some of them carry boxes for you, some of them learn your routines and frame it as care. Some of them rely on your desire to be kind, to be reasonable, to not cause a scene. Richard didn't break into my apartment with force. He walked in through every boundary I didn't enforce. And the scariest part, if I hadn't listened to that uneasy feeling, if I'd kept telling myself I was overreacting, I don't know how far he would have gone. I still live in that apartment. I changed the locks again just to be safe, installed better security. I talk to my neighbors now, really talk. We look out for each other in ways that don't involve control or secrets. And when someone gives me a bad feeling, I don't argue with myself about it anymore. Because sometimes bad vibes aren't nonsense. Sometimes they're your instincts noticing a pattern before your brain is ready to admit it. And sometimes the nicest person in the building is the one you should never have trusted at all.